Hi, and welcome to Cloud on Air, live webinars from Google Cloud hosted every Tuesday. My name is Elise Roche, and I work around data for social and environmental impact.
I'm Jake Porway, the founder and executive director of DataKind.
And we're here today to talk to you about leveraging data science for social change. As a quick note, you can ask questions throughout the webinar on the platform as we have Googlers on standby ready to answer them. And we'll also be hosting a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. So with that, let's get started.
That's good.
So another way to express the idea of data science for social change is data for good, which is an interdisciplinary movement where private companies are working with nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and also IGOs in order to apply big data solutions to real-world challenges. And this has been going on for quite some time. A couple of highlights include, back in 2008, the CDC collaborated with Google to launch Google Flu Trends, under the idea that if you could actually track online searches, you would potentially be able to predict the prevalence of a flu outbreak. Later in 2011, the United Nations Global Pulse Initiative advocated for a data philanthropy movement, where private companies could actually donate or share data to advance humanitarian causes. And in 2013, the UN also utilized satellite imagery in order to provide targeted disaster relief by comparing pre- and post-disaster imagery to determine which communities needed emergency relief first. And in 2017, just last year, the UN hosted the world's first World Data Forum, with the belief that it would help to foster collaboration between different organizations and sectors, and also help to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which comprise the 2030 Agenda. And in 2018, today, there are interdisciplinary programs and collaborations. So companies like Google Cloud are working with organizations like DataKind in order to bring the Data for Good movement to life.
So what I think is so fascinating is that this is still very young in a lot of ways too. There hasn't yet been a killer app for social impact, and there probably won't be, because though groups have started to find solutions like these, really what I think people are learning in these first 5 or 6 years that this has been up is that collaboration is really the key. Technologists don't always know exactly what to build, social organizations don't have the tech skills, and so I think this last point here is so critical, that for all the cool whiz-bang solutions we're seeing, collaboration, interdisciplinary work is really key to this movement growing.
Absolutely. So what is Google Cloud doing in the Data for Good movement? Well, since 2008, we have sought to empower nonprofits by offering essentially integrated solutions for them to access, starting with Google Earth Outreach, allowing them to essentially bring their stories to life using Premium Maps APIs and geo tools. With G Suite for nonprofits, also nonprofits are able to work and collaborate together with productivity tools using Gmail and Docs at no charge. And also GCP public data sets, which actually helps to democratize access to planetary scale data sets provided by organizations like the World Bank, the EPA, and NOAA, just to name a few. And now anyone can essentially query that data up to 1 terabyte per month for free. And last but not least, there's Kaggle and their Data Science for Good events, which allows nonprofits to host an online event and to tap into the community of over 1.5 million data scientists in order to apply big data solutions to real-world problems. And in addition to that, we're exploring working with nonprofit organizations in a hands-on capacity, like with DataKind. So back in April, we actually worked with them around their ecosystem event at the Skull World Forum for Social Entrepreneurship, where we discussed the potential of applying big data solutions to real-world challenges in the humanitarian sector, and also worked with nonprofits to help scope potential data analytics projects for future engagements. And in addition to that, just a couple of weeks ago, we hosted one of their DataDives, which is a weekend-long problem-solving event at the Google New York City office, which is actually where we're streaming from today. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. But before we dive in there, wanted to rewind and actually talk about DataKind, who they are and what they stand for.
Awesome, thanks Elise. So a little background on DataKind is that we're a nonprofit dedicated to harnessing the power of data science and AI in the service of humanity. And the organization really arose from experiencing lots of data scientists, machine learning folks, AI engineers who clearly wanted to give back but didn't exactly know how. At the same time, realizing that social organizations were awash in data. I mean, we all are, right? There's digital information popping off of our cell phones and our laptops. And so we have these new opportunities to learn more about our world and ourselves than ever before. And so really we thought the best way to do that was not just to have industry building what it's building with data science and machine learning, but finding ways to get those same tools into the hands of people working on social impact, whether those are governments or nonprofits or anyone else dedicated to seeing a better world. And as a data scientist myself, it started just by talking to a few folks and saying, hey, does anyone else want to work with some nonprofits? And being very surprised to find that not only did people in my own friend group want to do it, but we had thousands of people around the world writing and saying, hey, I want to do this too. Nonprofits and governments raising their hands and saying, we want to be part of the Data for Good movement. So that's how the organization started, and we run it a lot like Doctors Without Borders for Data Geeks. We just get folks who want to volunteer and give their time back to work and build solutions alongside nonprofits. In the last 6 years, we've done about 250 projects. We've got about 18,000 folks signed up as volunteers and a bunch of communities running DataKind versions in their own cities as volunteer chapters. So I'm very excited to see this Data for Good movement growing immensely over the last couple of years. It'll give you just a few quick examples of what some of the projects look like. So one was a project we did with the American Red Cross. They're a fantastic organization, and one of the challenges they were trying to solve was how to stop preventable fires. So there's a problem where if a fire goes off and people don't have a smoke alarm in their home or in their buildings, they can get hurt or worse, they can die because they can't get out. So the Red Cross decided we're going to put millions of smoke alarms for free around the country. But the question was, where do they start? Where should you put these? So we teamed them up with some data scientists who combined their data about fire data along with publicly available data from community housing data or open data that others had made available to build a predictive model that said, look, these are the places where if you put smoke alarms, they're going to be most effective for saving lives. You can see that little map on the slide shows the areas where they thought there would be the most fires and the most folks that could be benefited from this. So now the Red Cross has intelligence to say, here's where we can go to focus our limited resources. And they're now saving hundreds of lives per month with this algorithm. So that's one great example. Another example about a group trying to figure out where to use their limited resources is with the Molten Eagle Water District. Now, they give water to folks all across Southern California, and their job depends on being able to predict how much demand there is. And the stakes are high, because if they're wrong, the only way they have to solve this is to go take a dump truck, fill it up full of water across town, and ship it to the people that need the water wherever it's missing. And that's a huge cost, it's environmentally destructive, it's a bad thing. So some data scientists teamed up with them and saw if they could do better. And basically they built the tool that you're seeing in that picture on the slide, which is able to predict demand to the block by block level. And now they're not only able to get more water to millions of people in California, they've saved over $25 million just saved from this shipping costs and from being more efficient. So I think these are great examples of what can happen when you use data science and machine learning and prediction to help social organizations target their efforts more cleanly and better. So that is largely the work that was done there, but now you may ask, well, how does this happen? We've got a couple of different models for how we get data scientists together with nonprofits, but one is our DataDive. And DataDives are like social impact hackathons. We love that hackathons are high energy and you can get a lot done, but we tried to modify them so that we really made sure that by the end of these events, social organizations and nonprofits had something that they could use. So for our DataDives, basically we've got 3 phases. The first is exploration. So we worked for a while with these nonprofits figuring out what their problems are, where the data is, what can and can't be done. A lot of organizations don't even know what's possible at first. So we built that out so we could have really clear scopes and clear data, so that in the second phase, during this sort of big event, hundreds of volunteers could show up and just start working. They could hack away at a problem they wanted. We had the nonprofits there that they could sit and talk with. And so for 48 hours, they worked on these problems so that in stage 3, we could hand off those solutions to partners and find that groups didn't just come up with interesting ideas or a few creative starts like you often see in hackathons, but actually made real progress on their goals so that the nonprofits could all walk away with something that they could use. So that was basically the setup for how we work and what we did at the DataDive. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the event itself.
Absolutely. So from the Google Cloud side, we actually realized the potential of this kind of model to drive real-world impact, which is why we hosted one of the DataDives in our Google New York City office, drawing over 130 attendees from data scientists to analysts to designers, all passionate about defending human rights with data and also building resilient communities. The nonprofit organizations that we worked with over the course of that weekend all worked around international development projects or defending different communities from the harmful effects of international development projects. And these 3 organizations were the Inclusive Development International, Accountability Council and also International Accountability Project. And over the course of the weekend, they were actually able to make significant progress on the challenges that they posed and walk away with tangible solutions that they would be able to then integrate immediately into their processes, which is truly inspiring because you actually see that you can sit down in a room full of computers with a room full of very talented and technical data scientists and then take that and immediately throw it into the real world and have that impact. And in addition to all of that, we actually had the opportunity to host a Google Cloud breakout session where we discussed the currently available tools and resources for nonprofit organizations and how they can access them through Google for Nonprofits, Kaggle, and also GCP public data sets. So on the projects themselves and the nonprofits.
Yeah, so let's talk about these folks. As Elise mentioned, they're all in the international development space, which means that all these organizations are focused on defending communities who need help representing their rights or getting representation when international development is happening in their area. But they each tackle a very different piece of this. And I thought that was kind of interesting as you listen to the three projects. So the first was the International Accountability Project. And their whole purpose is to advocate, make policy change, boost local advocacy efforts to make sure that communities know about every international development project happening around them and can act on them or defend themselves when needed. Now, they're a pretty visionary organization. I love these folks because they're already data savvy in the sense that they have worked really hard to collect a whole database of every international development project they know of that's going on. So they could tell you right now what's going on in Peru or in Ghana and who's responsible for it. So that's really great, and they've already done that. The challenge that they had for this weekend, however, is that they were trying to understand how they could get more updated information about what's going on. So there are news articles or press releases that happen around these projects, but they just go off into the ether. So IAP thought to themselves, hey, if we had this information, maybe we could have an early warning system when we know there's going to be a new project or when it's going to change. But what that would require is scraping huge amounts of news information and matching it. So that's what the volunteers set about doing. They basically scraped tons of news articles and press releases. They built some semantic matching algorithms, some classifiers to try to understand which projects these articles reacted to or related to. And then they pulled that all together into one workflow that actually now pulls that data, tags it, and puts it in this database. And so now IAP is walking away with a whole API on top of this new data model that basically gets current events and news media into their system so they can act more effectively. Now this allows them to get ahead of changes, get communities ready before they ever could before. So it's kind of like having early sight, which I think is awesome. So that was IAP, that was one group, fantastic work, and they're going to be continuing that on. The second group we want to talk about is Inclusive Development International. Now, Inclusive Development International, or IDI, they're basically focused on following the money. So whenever there's an international development project, say you're building a mine in Ghana, they want to know all of the funders, who are the banks and investors in these projects. So that if something does go wrong, if there's an unethical activity, they can understand who those funders are and go to them. Say, hey, did you know about this? Maybe we should take some action. Now, that's all well and good, but if you think about what it's like to be IDI, when they want to know who all those funders are, they have to basically go out and find all that information each time. So you have to go to each development bank's website. You've got to type in the development project's name. You've got to get that information, copy it, paste it, etc. It's this huge, laborious human project. So what they were focusing on this weekend was trying to figure out if they could automate that process. So could they basically automatically scrape this data and put it all into one workflow so that they could have this kind of at a moment's notice. So that's what they set out to do. And miraculously, in just 48 hours of this weekend, they set out to build 13 scrapers. The team built 11 scrapers in that time that were all working collecting that information. So they can now scrape that information. There's a front end that they're building that now allows IDI to go in and just type that project name, get all that information in one click, and basically go about doing the work that they really need to do. Mm-hmm. So it's saving their time from this human join that they're basically doing, and instead automating it so that they can focus on the work ahead. So they're going to be building that out, and they were really excited to say that they could just immediately start using this right after the weekend.
That's great.
Yeah.
And Accountability Council. So they actually work around amplifying the voices of communities around the world to help protect them from the harmful effects of international development projects. And an example of this that's worth noting is that they actually have been working with a series of villages in Ukraine who are facing the harmful effects of industrial farming, where they're living with 17 million chickens housed in a series of structures that extend as far as the eye can see. And there's actually a picture of this on the next slide. And so the Accountability Council is actually working with them to fight back against the company and the development banks that are funding them in order to address the pollution, the water scarcity, and the pesticide use that all result from intensive animal farming. And the challenge that they posed to the DataKind community during the DataDive was, analyze online complaints and identify which aspects of these complaints actually determine success. Is it something as simple as the time in which they're filed? Is it the number of valid issues associated with the complaint? So they dug a little bit deeper, and they analyzed a series of projects and data across a variety of different websites, and then consolidated that in one website in order to analyze that. And from there, they actually came up with a series of high impact insights, one of which is actually pictured on this slide, where they noted that there is a 50% chance, or more than a 50% chance, that a complaint would become eligible to be addressed if it has 3 issues or more. So that's something that they can immediately start integrating into their processes and consider when filing these complaints. If they just have 2, but there's an opportunity to add a 3rd one, that would then help to ensure the success of that particular complaint.
Totally.
And so it's worth noting that, at the end of the day, we're talking about real people with real problems, and this data and this kind of work that we're doing over, a DataDive weekend can have immediate impact.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, sometimes when people hear these examples, they're like, yeah, but, that's not like, scale. That's not, millions of people affected or, terabytes of data analyzed. Sometimes it's not, but really, like Elisa was saying, these are people's lives that are affected by this. And so if Accountability Council can get 3 more complaints through, when you're that community or that family that is looking for help, getting that through versus not is a huge issue. That could be life or death. Mm-hmm. So really, I think that's what I hear in all of these is just that people's lives are being saved and helped so tangibly from this work.
Absolutely. And I think actually one of the villages in Ukraine filing that complaint with Accountability Council described them as one of their last hopes.
Wow. Yeah. And so I think that's why we're so excited by what we're seeing in these events, is that all these organizations are now boosting their missions with data science and machine learning. So one of the takeaways we see is just the shocking amount that gets done in 48 hours. You may think that if you're a nonprofit that a data science project has to take years upon years, you got to build a team first, but we see organizations that over a few months and then a quick weekend make huge progress just by getting folks together. And similarly, data scientists may think, well, what could I do? Well, there's a lot, and you can make a big difference in a little bit of time. And so that's, I think, really exciting, is that when the right people come together in the right way, you can get a lot done. The other thing, though, is that, of course, it's not just a weekend. Like, we're not going to solve every problem in a weekend. This would be foolish.
As much as we would like to.
As much as we'd all love that. These are systemic, endemic challenges. They're going to take a long time. Mm-hmm. But what I see in this is that this is a catalytic moment. These are organizations that are not just catching up with data science. They're visionary organizations on the front lines of social change, looking for all the ways that they can do their jobs better. And from something like a weekend event or doing some data science projects, here they're now starting this journey into something bigger. We've seen organizations often come back from this process able to go to their funders to say, hey, we need funding for a data science team because look at this complaint registry, or look at this, look what we can do. Mm-hmm. But that's huge. We see organizations going and actually now training some of their staff to do data science, or coming back and articulating their data science and machine learning problems. We've already heard that from some of these groups. So I think that's what's sort of the second takeaway for me, is not just how much great work gets done, but how it really catalyzes these data journeys for these organizations. And it's so critical that they get this resource because, again, they're on the front lines of making a better world for all of us, so we want them to have everything they can.
Absolutely. It's also, just think about it as a proof point. A proof point to then, with the nonprofit model, it can be difficult to secure resources to support a variety of different projects, and especially when they're trying out something new, it's great to be able to point to something that they found successful.
Exactly.
So that's great. And another thing just to add on to that, and a key takeaway on impact is the power of collaboration. So before, early on in the presentation, I discussed Data for Good as a movement between private companies and nonprofits, and that's something that we can see take place in events like the DataDive, and realizing that individuals and companies and organizations all have different resources and abilities. And so if you're actually able to take all that together and combine those resources and abilities and essentially deploy them against a strategic project that is driven by data, you can really make a change, really make a difference. So that's something that's really inspiring. And being there present at my first DataDive as well, while we were hosting it in Google, New York, I saw all of that come to life, and it really was an impactful experience for me. And I believe it was that way for the volunteers as well. So, and especially the nonprofit organizations that benefited from it.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think just adding on that for anyone who's listening, there's a Burundian quote I love, which is, "What you do for me without me, you do to me." And I think that's really important when thinking about designing these things in collaboration. There's not just going to be some tech solution that I could come up with in my room that's going to solve these problems, and the nonprofits couldn't necessarily solve them on their own. So if you're out there taking your own data journey, I think about that first and foremost. Not what can I build, but who can I build it with? Because that's really the way this stuff gets done. And I couldn't agree more. I was so heartened and enlightened seeing everyone work together and seeing that support across corporations, nonprofits, and everyone working together to make some good stuff happen.
Absolutely. Thanks. So, what can you do? Come together and join the Data for Good movement.
Yeah, I think I'd be remiss not to mention that, of course, at DataKind, we're always looking for folks to come be involved. So if you're a data scientist who wants to help out, come to datakind.org and come get involved. We have volunteer opportunities, we've got projects, there's jobs, all sorts of stuff going on. We also have meetup communities around the world that you could join, so please do that. And we're also starting to look for ways to go into issue areas more deeply, so keep an eye out. We will be having some very exciting projects coming up very soon around that.
Awesome. And also a note from Google Cloud. So with Kaggle, if you're a nonprofit, you can apply to actually host one of those online events to apply big data solutions to your mission or real world challenge. And if you are a data scientist, analyst, or whomever just looking to learn more about data analytics, you can actually sign up to join the Kaggle community and get started from there.
Perfect.
So with that, thank you. That's a wrap. And stay tuned for the live Q&A. Welcome back. We have the questions. So the first one, how can we make data science more accessible to the public?
Ooh, that is a great question. Let's see if we have the answers. So I think when I hear this question, what I think about is things I've heard people say about the fact that as technologists, we may understand what an algorithm can do or what statistical bias is. But for most people, I think about my aunt, my grandma, they're walking around just, clicking apps and having decisions made for them. So I think the question a lot of people wonder about is, how do we help people understand what this stuff does? Because if we don't, we run the risk of people not knowing if the data is being used unethically or not being able to engage in it, just being out there. So I think a couple things come to mind, for me. Basically, one is webinars like this. Yeah. We got to get out there and talk about it. You say stats or math or data, most people's eyes glaze over. But when you say, hey, here's a way that folks are using data to empower communities or to learn about when a development project's going to happen sooner, they go, oh, okay, I never really thought about data that way. I thought about spreadsheets or math, but that's actionable, that's cool. So I think we have to talk about it more. So if you're someone out there who knows about this stuff, shout it to the world. I do also think we probably need a little more public literacy around data and around algorithms. One thing I think a lot of people are frustrated by is the fact that so many people seem to be confused by what data does, or using data to prove a political point that maybe they shouldn't be making. And I think we haven't yet built a kind of public critical thinking around data. Like when you look at a newspaper article or a picture, some people have built this kind of critical lens about how someone took that picture, right? We know when we see a provocative image, we go, okay, well, there was a photographer, they chose to take this over something else, they probably have an agenda, what's the agenda? Hopefully people are thinking that way. But I don't think we're thinking that way about data yet. You see a chart, someone says 45% of people are likely to die from smoking or whatever, it doesn't even make sense. But I think people go, well, that's fact. No one thinks, well, what data did we collect or not collect? What's that person's angle? And so that's a kind of
Or even just what's on the X versus Y axis, and where do the numbers start there to actually then demonstrate a particular point versus zooming out and looking at the whole picture.
Exactly. There's like huge visual literacy and total tricks you can play with that. And that just takes training.
Yep.
Like we just have to get people used to that. So I think the more, again, we can talk about it, the more that we can educate people. Maybe even, this will be controversial, but replace calc classes in public education with statistics classes. I think that might be more relevant these days. Things like that I think are going to be helpful. But conversation has to start with the folks who know it, getting that out there. So get out there and talk more about it. I think that's going to be really helpful.
Yeah, I think it's also important to think about data science versus science, because they're not too different when you really think about them. So like a scientist, a data scientist will take observations, will actually come up with a hypothesis and then test that hypothesis, kind of using their own scientific method against the data and against the observations that they've collected, and then seek to derive a meaningful insight from there. And I think it's also, rhetorically looking at the term data, thinking about, what actually comprises data. It's a historical record, it's temperature, it's the amount of sunlight or rain in a particular area. It's a variety of things. It's anything that can be recorded. If you keep your own journal, you could consider that to be data, and then use your own kind of semantic analysis to actually see what are the most prevalent words that come up in this particular year or something within your journal. So really data can be everything or anything and everything, and it doesn't have to just be this kind of idea of binary.
Totally.
So.
Totally. And I'm so sorry. Before I move on to the next question, there's just one last thing I want to add here, which is that as data scientists, one of the things that we can do is just share out how we're doing what we do. So DataKind, one of our values we believe very strongly in, that we train everyone on, is transparency. The idea is that if you are clear about what assumptions you make, how you're using that data, what that data is, what you're trying to do, that's going to go a long way to people understanding what goes on. Well, let's face it, there's some not so great things going on in the image of tech these days. One of the best ways to combat that is to just be open about what we're doing. And I think that's going to help demystify a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think demystify is a really, just good term to think about.
Nice.
So on the next question, what is the role of data science, in your opinion, in the humanitarian sector, especially given your work with DataKind and you founding the organization? I'd love personally to hear about, your kind of intention and thoughts around this in founding your organization.
Oh, well, thank you. I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well, because I know you've seen a lot of data for humanitarian work. Look, I think it actually comes back to what is the role of data science first and foremost. Like you said, it's like science. Yep. You're getting information. You're able to not just look in the past now, but sometimes predict the future. That's a pretty new human ability at scale. There's so much more data that allows us to do that. And of course, so many more things that we can automate. Like we said in the webinar, how many person hours are spent just typing things into a computer and collecting that information when you could be out actually solving problems. So that's the kind of stuff that I think data science and machine learning is great for. So why is that different in the humanitarian sector? I think it's actually not that much different. I think anywhere someone has a clear thing that they're working on to get more people into homeless shelters, to speed up transportation, to prevent global warming, all that stuff, there's opportunities to learn from the past with data, predict what might happen in the future with data, and automate those processes. So I think that opportunity is everywhere. And that really ties back to your question about how we started the organization. At the risk of sounding a little grandiose, it almost felt immoral, for lack of a better word, that we could have this wonderful technology that could teach us so much more about our futures and automate what we do and not apply it for social good. If there wasn't a world where we were seeing this make the world a little bit better, then what are we really doing? So I think that's, to me, what's so exciting about this is that the whole big data revolution has put this opportunity in the hands of pretty much, well, many more people across the globe than ever before. So I think the opportunities are endless. I think whether it's the kind of big lighthouse projects that you see out there that seem really cool, like using satellite imagery to track poverty estimates, which you see the World Bank and others doing, to even just the mundane, seemingly mundane stuff, like optimizing someone's workflow so they don't have to fill something out by hand. All those things are resulting in the world being better thanks to data science. So that's what I see. I'm curious, what are you seeing similar things, or where do you see the role?
Yeah, I'd say that it's important to think about data analytics and data science as a tool and as a method, right? So I was actually just thinking about surveys, like qualitative surveys, and that's something that is also a method that nonprofit organizations, companies, whomever can also employ. But it doesn't, I mean, what are you going to do with a qualitative survey if you don't have essentially the underlying foundation for what you're trying to learn from that survey? So, with that being said, I mean, you can think about data analytics and machine learning in the same way. So what is this is going back to this idea of, data science similar to science. Like, what is the fundamental question that you're trying to solve? What is the, what is the potential of data analytics here to help you solve that? And how can you aggregate, organize, synthesize data in order to help you achieve that? So, something I actually heard from the nonprofit participants in the DataDive as well is really, the power of data, but also understanding that, it is something that needs a firm and guiding hand. You need to have that intention behind it, because also to your point from what you were saying before around, essentially data science and, well, the reality that, you have to have that underlying intention, that underlying, insight into something in order to actually bring something to life.
Start with the question, not the data. I can't remember who we ripped that off from, but it's on all our walls at the company, because you got to know what you're trying to do, and then this is in service of it. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So again, having that kind of, that guidance, that hand, also understanding, developing that understanding and the nuances of using these kinds of tools.
Couldn't agree more. Nice.
Next question. So what skills are needed to take part in the Data for Good movement? What do you look for in your volunteers?
Oh, such a great question. I think when people hear this, they think, oh, so I've got to be some, AI expert, machine learning engineer. And yes, there's a place for that. We definitely need that. But when I actually think about what the hardest parts of this work are, it's really around communication and collaboration. So imagine this, like if you're a data scientist, you probably do work for a company, and there's data that comes in through infrastructure and QA, and you've got business objectives, and you can just kind of get in there and tweak things, optimize, build some models on some nice clean data. Now imagine that you're thrust into a nonprofit organization that does not have that data infrastructure, where they cannot necessarily articulate their data science problem, where all of a sudden you've got ethical factors weighing in, you've got people who have tons of different constraints on them. The skills you start to need are skills like being able to hear someone's request and really understand what the underlying need is. The Red Cross project that we spoke about before is actually a good example. So when we first came to them, one of their teams, the question was, how do we upgrade our databases? That's our data problem. And sure, this databases probably needed to be upgraded, could have done that, but it took some data scientists with a smart analytical mindset to step back and, to your point, ask the question, start with the question, not the data, and say, well, what are you trying to do? And that's how they eventually got to this idea that, well, we're trying to prevent fires, we need to put the smoke alarm somewhere. Well, how do you do that? We're not sure. And that's how they found the data science problem. So I would say that's actually really some of the most critical skills, whether with DataKind or anyone else in the Data for Good movement, that are needed. Being able to hear a problem and understand what the solution could be. To come at a problem with humility. To realize that we may know technology, but that's it. I mean, these other people know the space, their issue area, the people involved. To come in and not think I've got the solution, but instead say, hey, maybe I could be some support, possibly. I think that humility is a big role. And then being able to communicate across all the technologists and non-technologists. I think those are huge. So I would say, as much as the work we do is around tech and we need expert technologists, those other kind of critical thinking and collaborative communication skills are almost worth more. So I'd say bring those. And also, if you're feeling like, yeah, but what if I'm not in that boat either? Hey, don't worry. This whole thing is a big pro bono operation. We need people who are project managers, communications experts, UX designers. There's a role for almost anyone in this movement because, again, it touches all of us. We're shaping society together. So really, there's room for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so you said something I was thinking about myself was just critical thinking, being a critical thinker. So having, you don't necessarily need, even though we are talking about technology, we are talking about data analytics and science, you don't necessarily need to have a technical background of really any kind to participate, as long as because you were mentioning before, this consulting, just this idea of being having consulting experience or something could absolutely be useful.
Totally, all those management consultant frameworks that everyone laughs at, they're really useful for getting people to think through a problem, and that's where you have to start to get this stuff right.
Yeah. And also, I'd say research experience. So if you have conducted any qualitative or quantitative research outside of data science, that's something you can also employ. The ability to synthesize large amounts of information, especially if they're provided by said nonprofit organizations, so you can then parse out those individual questions that we were talking about before that are critical for data science. I'd say that's also something that is a very useful skill in the Data for Good movement, and also design. So increasingly, data visualizations are very important to expressing data, because if you think about it, as an average person or consumer, if a scientific report comes out, that's not necessarily reaching you, and if it is reaching you, it's often distilled in a series of ways, right? And similarly, data analysis can then be achieved or published in a certain way within kind of a niche group, but it's not necessarily reaching the average person. So with that being said, data visualization actually comes into play there. That's incredibly useful to synthesize information. That's something you can actually do with Data Studio on the Google Cloud side, which connects to Google BigQuery, where you could, for example, analyze the GCP public data sets that are available, as I mentioned before, from the World Bank, EPA, NOAA, et cetera, and then visualize that information, explore, see what you can find in Data Studio.
Love it.
Because that helps to drive action. You have a dashboard, you have these clean charts and maps, and really whatever you'd like to customize from there, and you can share with others.
Very cool. I think we have maybe time for one more, or you want to try to do both lightning?
Let's see. Maybe you want to try both lightning?
All right, let's go for it.
We've been waxing on. Okay. So next question. Where can data science make the most impact?
Ooh, this is a great question. People always ask, what's the issue area to go into?
It's a tough one.
I'd say there's almost no limit, right? Because as we mentioned, data science can help with seeing the future and automating, and you can use that everywhere. I will say I think we see great opportunities wherever there's a really kind of quantifiable outcome that everyone's agreed on. So your health outcomes, like eliminating a disease, food transport, water, those are a little easier than some of the more like human rights advocacy level kind of projects, but there's still opportunity there too. But I think maybe one of the ways I'm going to spin this, even in the lightning round, is what considerations do you have to think of in different issue areas? Because remember, places that are working for human rights, data has been used as a weapon against them. I mean, you get data about vulnerable communities, governments use that against folks. So there's still great room for data science to be used, but you got to go about it in a totally different way. There has to be a huge lens on privacy, ethics, and consideration. You really have to work through those groups to understand how to protect these communities. So maybe that's what I would say is there's room everywhere for it. There's so many opportunities, but you might have to take a slightly different tack in each of the different areas.
Yeah, and I'd say quickly, I think that a huge opportunity for data science and analytics is the environment. And that's something that you can see. You mentioned before World Bank and satellite imagery. Well, satellite imagery can also be used to, for example, track deforestation in the Amazon or in other highly biodiverse regions. That's something that Google Earth Outreach has been working on with different indigenous organizations and protecting their ancestral lands. And that's something that data analytics, analysis, GIS, that all can be supremely helpful.
Nice.
And last question,
Last one.
Okay, so how did DataKind select their engagement models, and what's next?
Okay, well, let's think of it this way. The whole purpose of this organization is to see data science applied to any social challenge where it could be useful. And so we picked engagement models that could tap into existing talent and just kind of sew it together as easy as possible. We laugh. We often say we're the weaver of worlds. Like, we don't have a lot of technologists on staff, because most of our job is just coordinating experts in the social sector and technology to come together to do great things. So we picked them that way to try to make sure that people have the least overhead to helping from either side as they want to. And so when you ask what's next, all I can think of is we're working to scale that out. So we want to know if you're out there and you want to build a DataKind community on your own, let us know. We're working with some exciting news coming out. We're working with a foundation to be thinking in the next few months about how we can grow out and replicate this model. So I would basically just leave this as an open call to people to say, if you're a corporation, a university, nonprofit, anyone else who wants to see more data for good in the world, wants to think about how to scale it, come talk to us. Come to datakind.org and write us an email, because we've got some big plans there and love you all to be a part of it.
And you also have several chapters, right?
We do. We have volunteer chapters around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've been learning from the 5 we have. They're in places that are rich in both nonprofits and tech, but we want to take it beyond that. How do we get this in every city, every organization that wants it? So again, if you have ideas on that, come talk with us.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time and for joining me here in the New York office.
Thank you.
It was really great just talking about the DataDive and the work that we were able to do together. And so we're actually at time for this webinar. So with that being said, we'd like to thank you all out there as well, and say stay tuned for the next session, because what's coming up next is accelerating insights with external data sets on GCP. Thanks again.
Thanks.